Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. Our current session focuses on recapitulating some methods. Well, my dear students, there are a lot of methods that have been developed through the times for the teaching and learning of languages, and this session will summarize some methods that are used in language teaching. In this session, we will review 8 methods. We will summarize grammar translation method, the direct method, audiolingual method, total physical response method, the silent way method, community language learning, suggestopedia, and whole language method. Well, my dear students, methods and approaches differ in their theoretical background. They also differ in so many other ways, for example, in terms of their focus and goals, views on teachers and learners' roles, the techniques that are used and the forms of interactions that are used, their attitude towards errors or the flaws in learning, the use of mother tongue, the perspectives on the use of mother tongue also vary from one method to the other. Also, each of these methods place the role of instructional materials in a different way. Each of these methods has its strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats as well. The first method that we would quickly review is grammar translation method, which was derived from the classical or traditional method of teaching Greek and Latin languages. It aimed at analyzing and studying the grammatical rules of language. The focus was on the teaching and learning of grammar. This method was based on the written texts and presentation of the rules of a particular grammatical item. Syntactic structure and grammatical rules were focused upon, and by practicing the use of that item through writing various sentences, actually by translating the foreign language into the first language and the first language into the foreign language, this is how the learning process or the teaching process would take place. As far as the strengths of this method are concerned, forming good academic knowledge of the target language is one of its strengths. Also, it inculcated a kind of grammatical accuracy and gave training of grammatical accuracy to the learners and developed the memory or rote learning in students. When we come to the weaknesses of grammar translation method, well, speaking and listening both were completely ignored. More attention was focused on the contents and especially in the written form. So the result was that the learners who would learn a language through this method, they would have a little ability to communicate in the target language. It is interesting that grammar translation method is still widely used in the world, especially in the South Asian part of the world, the part of the world where we belong to, though the method is without a theory. And no literature is available that offers a rationale for the justification of the use of this method. Another method that followed this method is the direct method, which we can compare and contrast with the grammar translation method. By the end of the 19th century, actually, the grammar translation method had failed to meet the requirements of the times, and this was the time when the direct method was introduced. It was adopted by key international language schools such as Berlitz and InLingua in the 1970s, and many of the language departments of the Foreign Service of Institute of the US States Department also used it during 2012. Now, there were certain tenets that this method advocated, which included no teaching of formal grammar, primacy of spoken word, and no use of native language. If we compare this with grammar translation method, we can realize that this is a complete opposite to the grammar translation method. Printed word, according to this method, was to be kept away from the student. The learner is only to be introduced to the oral language first. They are to be presented orally with the help of some actions to be accompanied that the teacher would do, and culture would be considered as a key part. So the direct method believed that learners should experience the new language in the same way as he or she would experience mother tongue without considering the existence of his or her mother tongue. as I said earlier, if we compare both the methods, this method did not allow any translations. Oral training was used to help improving later on at the later stages reading, and even after that writing. Grammar is to be taught indirectly, not teaching the rules explicitly. When we consider the strengths of this method, well, practical goals and immersion into foreign environment was made possible through this method. Focus was on speaking and listening, so the learners who would learn this through this method, they would be more fluent and they would be able to communicate in a better way. Also, the skills that were introduced, they were introduced in a natural order, in the natural way how we learned skills of language as we learn our first language, that is from listening to speaking to reading to writing. However, there are certain weaknesses as well. For example, it underestimated reading and writing, and actually it was completely a counterproductive prohibition of the mother tongue, which interfered with, which stopped or which hindered the learning of language, and there was an overestimated role of mechanical drills as well. So, though the direct method was an answer to the grammar translation method, but in the over enthusiasm to counter it by juxtaposing every idea that was given in grammar translation method, this method also was not a great success. Another method that we can review is audiolingual method, that was considered to be very much an American method. Some of its basics can be traced to almost simultaneous developments that took place in the Great Britain and in the USA. In fact, towards the second half of the 20th century, British applied linguists such as Hornby, Palmer, and West developed principles and procedures of what was called structural situational method. The emergence of the audiolingual method actually was a kind of increased attention given to foreign language teaching in the United States towards the 1950s. Actually, after the First and then the Second World War, America and the American people and the government, they felt the need for the learning of foreign languages. It was prompted by the launching of the first Russian satellite in 1957 as well. So the National Defense Education Act 1958, among other measures, provided funds for the study and analysis of modern languages and for the development of teaching materials and for the trainings of teachers. The combination of structural linguistic theory, contrastive analysis, oral procedures, and behaviorist psychology, all these combined together, these varied theories and varied disciplines, they contributed towards the emergence of audiolingual method. Behaviorists also played a significant role, and they presented the idea or the theory of language learning, in which they believed that the learning of language is like the learning of any other skill. So, for example, the learning of a language can be equated with the learning of a bicycle or learning of driving a car. So, according to them, this is an incremental additive process. Discrete items of language should be introduced in carefully structured dialogues, and language should not be separated from culture. Well, my dear students, as far as the contents in audiolingual method are concerned, the teacher presents the elements of language forms, for example, in terms of nouns, verbs, adjectives, articles, relative clauses, subordinate clauses, etc. And all of these are introduced one by one to the learner. The learners are then supposed to put them together to figure out the totality of the language system. The language skills are taught in the order of natural occurrence, from listening to speaking to reading to writing. As far as the learner activities are concerned, they are confined to the audiolingual or gestural visual bands of language behavior, where the teacher would accompany, where the teacher would produce certain language forms accompanied by gestures. When reading and writing are introduced, students are taught to read and write what they have already learned orally. However, this method had some criticism. Basically, on two fronts, criticism was made. Number one, theoretical foundations of audiolingualism were attacked as being unsound. It was criticized that it does not have a sound theory. Secondly, students were found to be unable to transfer the skills that they would acquire through audiolingual method into the real life situations. So, learning a language through drills is something else, and performing it when it comes to real life is something else. This is one of the criticisms. Now, at MIT, Noam Chomsky rejected the structuralist approach to language description as well as the behaviorist theory of language learning, and he claimed language is not a habit. His theory of transformational grammar or transformational generative grammar proposed that the fundamental properties of language derive from innate aspects of the mind and from how humans process experience through language. Several alternative methods were proposed during the times in 1970s, which included total physical response method, the silent way method, and counseling learning. Well, with this we come to the review of total physical response method. It attempts to teach language through physical or motor activity, as the name suggests. It was developed by James Asher, who was a professor of psychology at San Jose University, California. Asher sees successful adult second language learning as a parallel process to first language acquisition of a child. And he claims that speech directed to young children consists primarily of commands which children respond to before they begin to produce verbal responses. In simple words, I would say, when learning a mother tongue, when an adult says, eat it, or drink it, or bring it, or sit down, before giving a response in language by saying okay or yes, the child actually performs the action of eating or of drinking. So the response comes in the form of action. This is the gist of this method. TPR involves game-like movements. It reduces the stress of the learner and creates a positive mood for the learners to learn. Thus, it facilitates the learning process. A total physical response course aims to produce learners who are capable of an uninhibited communication that is intelligible to a native speaker. So the purpose is to remove all the stress and to enable the learners in a very free environment, in a comfortable environment to produce the language. As far as the role of learners and teachers and materials is concerned, well, learners have a primary role of listeners and of performers. They listen attentively and they respond physically through action. With this, we come to the silent way method. This was introduced by Caleb Getagno, and the base of this is that the teacher should be silent as much as possible. Again, the name of the method, the silent way, suggests that. So the teacher is supposed to remain as much silent as possible and just to facilitate the process of language learning. Elements of the silent way particularly include the use of color charts and the colored rods that are used, for the educational purposes and that were designed by Getagno himself. The silent way shares a great deal with other methods and with other learning theories and educational philosophies, which include the following. Number one, learning is facilitated if the learner discovers or creates rather than remembers or repeats. Secondly, this method believes that learning is facilitated by accompanying physical objects. So in this method, physical objects that are present in the class are used for, stimulating the students. Learning is thirdly facilitated by problem solving that involves the material to be learned. Getagno takes an openly skeptical view of the role of linguistic theory in language teaching methodology, and he feels that linguistic studies may be specialization, carry with them a narrow opening of one's sensitivity, and perhaps serve very little towards the broad end in mind. The silent way method takes a structuralist approach to the organization of language that is to be taught. The sentence is the basic unit that is to be taught, so the teacher teaches small phrases or short sentences at the beginning and focuses on propositional meaning rather than the communicative value. Students are presented with the structural pattern of the target language and they learn the grammar rules of the language as it is taught through inductive process. When we come to the general objectives of this method, it aims at near native fluency in the target language. So the purpose is to give a kind of fluency where the learner can almost like a native speaker fluently speak the foreign language, and also the focus is on correct pronunciation. As far as the role of the learner is concerned, they are expected to develop independence, autonomy and responsibility, because when we compare the role of the learner with the role of the teacher, the role of the teacher is comparatively passive. The teacher is supposed to stay silent, whereas the learners are supposed to work cooperatively and cooperatively together rather than being competitive. So it's not a competition for the learners, it's rather cooperation in the process of learning. Teacher remains silent, and actually when we compare it with the very first method, the grammar translation method, and then the other methods on the way, for example the direct method or the audiolingual method, we would realize that there is a major shift in the role of the teacher. In all those methods, teacher was playing the central role. Teacher was the focus, teacher was controlling the activities, teacher was speaking a lot, for example in audiolingual method or in the direct method. But in this method, the teacher is supposed to stay silent and to play a very passive role. Stevik defines the silent way teacher's tasks as to teach, to test, to get out of the way. So to get out of the way, which means, to give a kind of freedom to the learners, is something that is very, very significant and is particular or peculiar to this method. With this, we move on to the next method, that is community language learning method, which was introduced by Charles A. Curran and his associates. He was a specialist in counseling and a professor of psychology at Loyola University, Chicago. Well, this method represents the use of counseling learning theory to teach languages. Now, in its viewpoint or perspective on language teaching, again, this method is unique because it draws on the counseling metaphor. It redefines the role of the teacher as the counselor and the role of the learner as the client. In CLL, a learner presents a message in L1 to the knower. The message is translated into L2 by the knower. Now, knower is the teacher. The learner then repeats the message in L2, addressing it to another learner with whom he or she wishes to or wants to communicate. Well, Curran himself wrote little about his theory of language. However, it was his student, Laforge, in 1983, who attempted to be more explicit about the theory or about this dimension of the community language learning method, where he proposed certain principles of this method. According to Laforge, language is people. Language is persons in contact. Language is persons in response. So, the totality of people or of human beings is important. And CLL interactions take place in two ways or in two kinds. Interactions between the learners, that is interaction of one learner with the other learner, and the interactions between the learners and the knowers, that is the learners and the teachers. As far as the role of the learner is concerned, it is very well defined, and learner becomes a member of the community of learners, and it is through interacting with the community that language learning takes place. As far as the role of the teacher is concerned, that is of counseling mainly. So personal learning conflicts, anger, anxiety, psychological disturbance, all these aspects that may affect the learning of language for a language learner, the teacher as a knower and as a counselor has to deal with all of these. My dear students, there is another important method that we need to review with reference to language teaching methods, and that is suggestopedia. It is also known as desuggestopedia. It was by the Bulgarian psychiatrist educator Georgy Lozanov. There are certain important characteristics of this method which include decoration, furniture, arrangement of the classroom, the use of music, and the authoritative behavior of the teacher. So in certain ways, this method is also unique because it uses it exploits the classroom environment, furniture, setting, etc., and uses music as a central element for learning processes. The claims of Suggestopedia learning are very dramatic. Because it is based on yoga, the feature of Suggestopedia is centrality of music and rhythm. So it is through music and rhythm, and by making the learners very, very much peaceful and comfortable, that the learning teaching process is done. The objectives of Suggestopedia are to deliver advanced conversational proficiency quickly and students' mastery of lists of vocabulary pairs that they can use for conversations. As far as the syllabus that is used in Suggestopedia is concerned, it has a very particular pattern or system. A course of Suggestopedia consists of the contents that are to be covered in 30 days. The course lasts for 30 days. It consists of 10 units of study, and classes are held for 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. So this is a very, very structured pattern of doing classes that is used in Suggestopedia. The central focus of each of the units is a dialogue consisting of 1,200 words or so with an accompanying vocabulary list and grammatical commentary. The dialogues are graded by lexis and grammar in terms of difficulty. So from the easy towards the difficult, both the grammar as well as the lexis, that the words would be, vocabulary would be introduced. Groups of learners are ideally socially homogeneous, so there shouldn't be differences, they shouldn't be heterogeneous. They have to be 12 in number and divided equally between men and women. They would sit in a circle where they would be encouraged to face each other, and sitting in a circle, they would have exposure to the new language items. So, the system or the pattern is very, very fixed and very, very rigid. The role of the teacher is to create situations in which the learner is most suggestible and then to present linguistic material. Suggestopedia, despite all its dramatic, claims, did not work well practically. So there was another method that was introduced, that is whole language method. The term was created in 1980s by a group of US educators who were concerned with the teaching of language, that is reading and writing in the native language. The whole language movement strongly believes that language should be taught as a whole, not in bits or in pieces. Whole language instruction is a theory of language instruction that was developed to help young children to learn to read, and also has been extended to middle and secondary levels and to the teaching of English as a second language or ESL. According to this method, language is something that is used for meaningful purposes and to carry out authentic functions. My dear students, I hope and expect that all the methods that have been reviewed in this session, they would enable you to recapitulate these methods, their advantages, their theories, and their differences from each other.